True power is not measured by wealth gathered or by crowns worn, but by the unshakable strength of a soul that remains unmoved when gold glitters, when authority tempts, or when desire whispers its promises. For the Stoics taught that the greatest empire a person can rule is the dominion over themselves. Imagine now walking into a grand hall of polished marble where kings once feasted and senators once plotted, a place where torches blazed against high ceilings and silver cups overflowed with wine, and in the center of it all stood a philosopher, clothed in plain garments, his eyes calm and steady as chaos swirled around him, untouched by the opulence that dazzled every other guest. The contrast is startling, almost theatrical, yet this is precisely the stage on which the Stoic mind reveals its power, to remain whole, unbroken, and free when surrounded by temptations that would consume lesser spirits. From this first glimpse, we step into the larger drama of history itself, where emperors, generals, and citizens alike were confronted by wealth, power, and temptation, and where the teachings of Stoicism offered a path to dignity in the midst of corruption and a voice of clarity in the clamor of ambition. The story of how the Stoics faced these trials is not an abstract tale of dusty philosophy, but a vivid lesson that still burns with relevance in every age. For every society builds palaces and markets, every society crowns leaders and worships wealth, and in every society men and women must choose whether to be mastered by what they seek or to master themselves instead. Let us then walk into the city of ancient Rome, not to marvel at its triumphal arches or glittering banquets, but to listen for the quieter strength of those who refuse to be carried away by the intoxicating pull of fortune. In the bustling forum, traders shouted over one another, coins clattered in hands and purses, and statues gleamed with offerings from the wealthy. Yet the Stoic philosopher passed through unmoved, seeing in the gold not a treasure, but a test, in the voices not promises, but distractions, and in the power of the Senate not an idol, but a shifting shadow. To him the question was never how much wealth one might gather or how high one might climb, but whether the mind could remain sovereign over its own desires. For what good is a crown on the head if the heart is enslaved by greed? What good is a chest full of riches if the spirit trembles at the thought of losing them? And what good is the loud applause of the crowd if one must betray reason to keep it? The Stoics confronted wealth with suspicion, not because coins themselves carried evil, but because of the way unchecked desire could twist them into chains. They confronted power with caution, not because governance or leadership was inherently corrupt, but because the intoxication of authority could erode judgment, and they confronted temptation with discipline, not because pleasure was forbidden, but because surrender to it was a form of defeat more humiliating than any battlefield loss. Picture the figure of Seneca, advisor to the emperor, surrounded by riches yet penning letters that warned of their danger, urging himself as much as his students not to let possessions possess the soul. Imagine Epictetus, once a slave, who, having tasted life without freedom, insisted that true liberty came not from gold or command, but from mastery of the will. And think of Marcus Aurelius, seated upon the imperial throne, with armies at his command, and the wealth of nations at his disposal, yet returning night after night to his journal, where he reminded himself that power is fleeting, that glory fades, and that virtue alone remains as a steadfast companion when fortune deserts us. In these lives, the teachings were not empty words, but shields held against the temptations of empire itself, shields that allowed them to remain whole in the face of pressures that would break almost any human being. The Stoic approach can be seen like a fortress, not built of stone but of inner strength, walls rising from self-control, gates guarded by reason, and towers crowned by virtue, and inside that fortress, no wealth, no temptation, no bribe, and no threat could breach the defenses. This image carries forward into our own age, for though the torches of Rome have burned out and the Senate has fallen to dust, the temptations remain the same, though clothed in new forms, the glowing screens of modern markets replacing the clatter of coins, the digital applause of followers echoing the roar of ancient crowds, the offers of influence or indulgence no less seductive now than in the past. To walk the Stoic path today is to stand in that same hall of temptation and choose calm over craving, to see wealth as useful but not defining, to accept power as duty but not intoxication, and to regard every temptation as a chance to prove the soul unshaken. As the philosopher walked through Rome, so too we walk through our own cities, surrounded by glittering promises, yet able, if we choose, to claim the same freedom, the freedom of a mind that does not bow to desire, but bends desire to its own rule. This, then, is the way the Stoics faced wealth, power, and temptation, not by denying their existence, for they knew these forces could build as well as destroy, but by refusing to surrender the throne of the soul to anything external, keeping the crown of true power firmly where it belongs, within. In the end, they left us not a command to reject life, but a call to live it more fully, to enjoy wealth without being enslaved, to wield power without being consumed, to meet temptation without being conquered. And so the question that remains, echoing across centuries from the marble halls of Rome to the glass towers of today, is one that no emperor, no merchant, no citizen can escape. Will you be the master of your desires, or will you allow your desires to master you? The grandeur of wealth, the thrill of power, and the sweetness of temptation were never illusions to the Stoics, for they knew well that these forces carried a certain reality and could shape the world. But their wisdom lay in refusing to mistake them for the essence of life itself. They observed how many who gained riches became their prisoners, how those who held command often found themselves chained to the expectations of others, and how indulgence in pleasure could soften the will, until it no longer had the strength to stand against hardship. To the Stoic, wealth was like fire, useful in its place but dangerous when uncontrolled. Power was like the sea, capable of carrying ships to safety or dashing them against rocks. And temptation was like wine, pleasant in moderation, yet ruinous in excess. The imagery of their teaching remains as vivid as the lives they led, and it allows us to see their choices not as dry logic, but as living examples of courage in the midst of danger. Picture Marcus Aurelius once more, surrounded by generals who urged conquest and senators who whispered flattery. Yet he wrote to himself that fame is nothing more than smoke, that wealth is nothing more than borrowed dust, and that power is nothing more than a role briefly played before being handed to another. This was not cynicism but clarity, for he understood that by lowering the false value of external things, he raised the unshakable worth of inner virtue. Imagine Epictetus teaching his students in a modest room, his leg twisted from the cruelty of past masters, yet his voice firm as he declared that no man could chain his soul without his consent, that no temptation could overwhelm him unless he opened the door of his will, and that wealth, power, and pleasure themselves could be turned into tools of growth if governed by reason. And see Seneca, accused by some of hypocrisy for his riches, yet wrestling openly with the tension between philosophy and fortune, reminding himself in his letters that possessions do not corrupt when kept at arm's length, but that the danger arises when we let them enter the heart. His struggle itself is a lesson, for it shows that Stoicism was not practiced in an ivory tower, but in the mess of real life, where temptations press and compromises threaten, and where the discipline of the soul must be renewed each day. The Stoics did not imagine themselves immune to temptation, nor did they boast of an easy mastery, but they knew that the daily labor of training the mind was the only safeguard against collapse. Their method was not to flee from wealth, power, or pleasure but to confront them directly, to look them in the eye and test whether the mind remained free. If wealth arrived, they accepted it as a traveler who might stay for a season and then depart. If power was given, they bore it as a duty, not as a crown. If temptation whispered, they listened only long enough to recognize its voice and then chose silence over surrender. This way of living can be imagined as walking through a marketplace full of voices, some offering gold, some offering glory, some offering delights of the body, and yet you move calmly through the crowd, neither hurried nor grasping, hands empty, but heart full, knowing that nothing they sell is greater than the peace you already carry within. This image is the Stoic gift, a reminder that freedom is not found in escape, but in mastery. Not in rejection of the world, but in ruling the self amid the world. And as the centuries have passed, the halls of wealth have changed, the seats of power have shifted, and the faces of temptation have been renewed. But the same challenge remains for us as it did for them. We too are offered wealth in the form of possessions and accounts. We too are offered power in the form of influence and recognition, and we too are tempted by pleasures, both subtle and loud. The Stoics would urge us to face these with courage, to enjoy them when they come without fear of loss, to wield them when they are given without pride, and to resist them when they demand our soul as their price. They would remind us that the marketplace of life never closes, that the stalls of wealth, power, and pleasure are always open, but that we may walk through it as free beings, buying nothing that would enslave us and selling nothing that would cheapen our spirit. And in the quiet of the night, when the noise of ambition falls silent, we are left with the same question that Marcus Aurelius asked himself, that Epictetus asked his students, and that Seneca wrote in his letters. What is truly mine, and what is merely lent to me by fortune? The answer to that question defines not only how we face wealth, power, and temptation, but how we live and how we die. For in the end, crowns crumble, coins scatter, and pleasures fade, but the soul that has mastered itself stands eternal, unbroken, and free. So when you next see the glitter of wealth, when you feel the pull of power, when you hear the whisper of temptation, remember the Stoics who walked before you, and ask yourself not what you can gain, but what you can keep unshaken, for that is the measure of a life well lived.